You've very likely not heard about this, and understandably so, but we need to talk about how the United States has waged this dirty, underhanded global campaign to advance the corporate interests of baby formula makers, all while fighting regulations and undermining the efforts of developing nations to protect the health of their children. Because that's what was just exposed in this absolutely stunning investigation by ProPublica. Right? They reviewed emails and memos by U.S. officials, correspondence to foreign ministries, letters from industry groups and academic research, as well as then conducting interviews with dozens of experts and government officials in almost 24 countries. And the final product we're left with is an unprecedented look into America's decades-long effort to protect the $47 billion formula industry at all costs. Right? Since the 1980s, countries and international groups have been trying to discourage the promotion of drinks intended to replace breast milk, particularly formula, which you see sold globally by huge companies like Mead Johnson, Abbott, and Nestle. And that first came after reports in the 70s that hundreds of thousands of babies in developing countries were getting sick and dying after drinking formula, with one study finding that during the peak of that controversy, an average of 212,000 babies in low and middle-income nations died every year from preventable deaths linked to formula. And there were a number of reasons for this. Some parents lived in places with contaminated water that babies were exposed to when formula powder was mixed with it. Also, overdiluted formula caused serious malnutrition. But at the very top level, breast milk is simply healthier than formula. It provides essential antibodies that can help prevent babies from getting sick. Even the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, promotes breastfeeding for the first 6 months after birth because of its well-established health and economic benefits, saying on its website that breastfeeding is one of the highest returns on investment of any development activity. And then on the flip side, a lack of adequate breastfeeding is associated with economic losses of about $302 billion each year, as well as annual preventable deaths of 823,000 children under 5 years old and 20,000 women. Now, all that said, it is true that formula is absolutely essential for babies who don't have access to breast milk. But public health experts have long said that aggressive marketing by formula companies encourages mothers to give their babies formula instead of breast milk, even when they have the option. One report by the World Health Organization and UNICEF explaining, the evidence is strong. Formula milk marketing, not the product itself, disrupts informed decision-making and undermines breastfeeding and child health. Right, so with all this, in 1981, the WHO passed the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And here's a fun fact you might not know. Because of that decision, formula is actually one of 2 products that have international recommendations for marketing, with literally the only other one being tobacco. But the US voted against that code, making it the only member country to do so. But still, 144 countries adopted those voluntary restrictions, and while they're poorly enforced in many places, or because they're not mandatory, there have still been some major benefits, with studies showing that breastfeeding rates rose in countries that embraced the marketing ban. But money's gonna money. With baby formula sales falling, the big corporations in the industry found a loophole, instead creating products for older babies and toddlers that weren't covered under most regulations. To grow the market for that branch of formula, which they called toddler milk, companies started adding nutritional supplements like the omega-3 fatty acid DHA. And while the industry claimed that DHA helped brain and eye health, that hasn't been proven, and studies have shown no links to brain and eye development. Beyond that, nutrition experts have noted that there are big doses of sweeteners and sodium in some brands of toddler milk, with studies showing that babies who breastfeed longer aren't as likely to become obese and develop diabetes as babies who drink formula. So many public health experts have criticized these companies' marketing tactics. Like last year, we saw the American Academy of Pediatrics publishing a report warning about the advertising for toddler formula. With that, the lead author of the study saying these products are, quote, misleadingly promoted as a necessary part of a healthy child's diet. Also adding that they're actually worse than infant formula for kids under 1 and offer no benefit over much less expensive cow's milk in most children older than the age of 12 months. But despite all that, these marketing ploys have worked fantastically. Not only have toddler milk sales grown, they have surpassed baby formula sales worldwide, skyrocketing 25% over the last decade to nearly $20 billion, even though they're way more expensive than milk. Or 2 gallons of toddler milk can cost as much as $30. And the high sales there also benefited the sales of infant formula, because by marketing toddler milk, these companies also indirectly promoted baby formula. And that's even in places that prevented them from explicitly doing so, or via cross-promotion, with regular infant formula sales also growing about 10% worldwide to $15 billion in the same period. And for the big formula companies, expanding to developing economies is even more beneficial for sales because it creates this positive feedback loop. With, for example, the CEO of Mead Johnson explaining during a 2013 earnings call that mothers who give their babies formula instead of breastfeeding can enter the workforce earlier, which then gives them more money to continue buying expensive formula products. And all the while this is happening, as formula sales were thriving, the big multinational manufacturers were forcefully fighting efforts by developing countries to regulate formula. And all of that with the backing and muscle of the US government. And yes, that's even though it goes against the government's own stated position and efforts on breastfeeding as stated by USAID. And according to ProPublica, the Office of the United States Trade Representative was at the center of many of these efforts, with emails showing that USTR staff was, quote, in regular contact with formula makers and their industry groups through meetings, calls, and position papers, which the industry used to hammer its objections to regulations around the world. Documents also show that USTR officials and others in other trade-focused agencies would then echo those claims in, quote, communications with other countries or in international forums like the World Trade Organization. And as ProPublica noted, these endeavors were first made public back in 2018 when it was reported that Trump administration officials threatened to withhold military aid to Ecuador unless the country dropped a WHO resolution supporting breastfeeding. And while US officials denied those allegations, ProPublica ProPublica wrote that its investigation has discovered that the scope of the interference far exceeded that incident and continues today under the Biden administration, and describing this as a worldwide crusade against regulation that has spanned Republican and Democratic presidential administrations and touched more than a dozen countries, including South Africa, Guatemala, and Kenya, as well as Southeast Asian nations such as the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And in many of those places, those efforts have worked. Like in Hong Kong, for example, where authorities ended up watering down proposed formula regulations after U.S. officials sent a letter saying that the rules could result in a significant commercial loss for U.S. companies. Similarly, a proposal in Indonesia was also stalled after the U.S. questioned it at the WTO. But the most egregious and detailed example in this investigation is Thailand, which notably is the 7th biggest formula market in the world. Right? And Thailand actually adopted the WHO's code on marketing for breast milk alternatives. But that's had very little impact because manufacturers just don't care about violating it, with a 2022 study identifying as many as 227 instances of formula marketing that went against the law. And a Thai doctor telling ProPublica about a meeting 2 decades ago where health experts begged formula companies to comply with the voluntary regulations that they regularly broke, but saying instead they refused, and adding, one company said, "If I do not violate, I cannot compete with other companies." And explaining the tactic is, "I will violate your law and prepare the budget for the fine." Also, beyond that, Thailand's restrictions haven't done much to limit practices like cross-promoting infant formula through toddler milk marketing. And there's been a very real impact, right? In 2022, just 1 in 3 mothers in Thailand exclusively breastfed their babies during the first 6 months. And the worst part of all this is that Thai officials have actively tried to address these issues. But again, the U.S. government intervened, preventing the country from taking steps to help their own kids. Right back in 2017, when Thailand's breastfeeding rate was among the lowest in the world, health officials tried to put an end to aggressive formula marketing, arguing that it misled parents and even persuaded them not to breastfeed, contributing to the nation's low breastfeeding rate. But according to ProPublica, U.S. trade officials worked closely with formula makers to wage a diplomatic and political pressure campaign to weaken Thailand's proposed ban on formula marketing. They wrote pointed letters to Bangkok asking questions like whether the proposal was more trade restrictive than necessary. They also criticized the bill at bilateral trade meetings and at the WTO, where those kinds of complaints can result in expensive legal battles. And when the government ultimately did pass the legislation, oh shocker, the parts that the U.S. had complained about the loudest, they got watered down or removed entirely. While the law banned advertising infant formula and outlawed cross-promotion, it still allowed marketing toddler milk products for 1 to 3-year-olds. And also with this, wouldn't you know it, there's even more. Because the U.S. is meddling in other countries' efforts to safeguard the health of their own population, it goes beyond just fucking up individual nations. They've also done it at the international rulemaking level. For example, back in 2016, the World Health Organization released recommendations on ending the promotion of formula products for toddlers and infants. But almost immediately, the formula industry launched a massive lobbying campaign, with companies and trade groups spending nearly $7 million lobbying U.S. officials about who matters just that year. And that's after they hadn't lobbied the government on who matters for the last decade. And so as a result, U.S. trade officials repeatedly questioned science, setting up fights with health officials, including the CDC, which pushed against removing language from the guidance that the trade officials ignored. And in the end, the U.S. delegation successfully convinced WHO nations not to endorse their own staff's recommendations, instead just voting on a watered-down version of the guidance that seriously undercut any utility. And that had a very tangible impact on the ability of countries to set their own regulations. Right just after that, when Thailand first proposed its new regulations, the U.S. and other big dairy producers accused the country of trying to obstruct trade. And when Thailand countered by pointing to the WHO's own guidance, the U.S. hit back by arguing that the guidance wasn't an international standard. Though, of course, that was because they had fought to make sure the guidance lacked enforcement. Right? And all these efforts are still ongoing today, despite the fact that the Biden administration told ProPublica that it was respecting the role of foreign governments to make their own regulatory decisions, claiming the USTR under Biden has moved away from efforts that give power to corporate players over foreign governments. But there, the outlet found that in 2021, Biden admin officials pushed back against stricter formula marketing rules in the Philippines, saying they had fears about regulatory spillover in Southeast Asia. They also tried to remove some language from a proposed ad ban in Kenya. And in fact, just last year, during a conference in Germany, U.S. officials opposed a reference to formula ad bans and a new international food standard for toddler milk, noting that the move came after industry lobbying. But ultimately, that is where I'm going to end this segment today, which I guess is your semi-daily example of corporate interests interfering in other countries. Again, news.